Hello? Hi. Hi. I guess we're going to get started now. My name is Marc Umeno. I'm a product manager that is working on vSphere configuration profiles. So how many of you today are already doing configuration management of your ESX hosts? Yeah? And you might be using host profiles or your own custom scripts or PowerShell or something like that to manage configuration. So what we've been doing in vSphere, starting with vSphere 8.0 U1, is adding a new capability to manage configuration in a more powerful way. And so what I mean by configuration management, to be specific, is to configure or provision software to do desired state management and detect drift, and then help with security and compliance. Okay? So the vSphere configuration profiles uses a declarative desired state model and approach, just like VLCM for image management, for lifecycle management. Okay, so the general pattern is that you set a configuration on a cluster and then check to see if the hosts in that clusters are compliant with that desired state. If they're not in compliance, then you can remediate them. And I'll go into a bit of detail later on and show exactly how that works and why we think it's a very powerful way to manage configuration on your host. This is a improvement over host profiles, and I'll explain why that is in a little bit, okay? But in general, what it is it's a framework that we got all the ESX engineering teams to buy into, and now they've re-implemented configuration through the ESX config store. And then we built this feature on top of that, but I'll get into the details in a second. And as I mentioned before, it's available in 8.0 U1 or later. With the latest version of 8.0 U3, it has a pretty full coverage of configuration, as well as support for VUM baseline. So you can use either VUM or VLCM with configuration profiles. Okay, so as mentioned, the heart of this configuration management system is the ESXi config store. So like I said, we have gotten all the teams to implement their configuration through this configuration store. And this was implemented actually in vSphere 7. And that's, over time, you're able to access through the ESX CLI maybe, but now you can manage it through vCenter through this new feature. Okay? The main thing to think about is that this exposes all configuration that you as an admin can change, and it only manages the changes from default. So there might be like over 2,000 things you can configure in ESX. But this says, what are the things that are different than the defaults that you want to manage? So maybe there's only 10 to 20 things. So it stores those deltas from the defaults, and the other 2,000 plus configurations are just set at the defaults. So in addition to that, we also have some internal state that you can read from this in config store, but we don't manage it actively because you don't have access to that. And as I mentioned before, the vCenter wide, the thing that you manage at the vCenter level is for configuration profiles is built on top of this foundation. Okay, so here is kind of the end-to-end picture of how to use configuration profiles. So you can start by managing the cluster. Okay, like I said before, in 8.0 U3, you can also use VUM baselines. Then you enable this on the cluster, right? Once that's enabled, then you can create a configuration profile. You can do that from a reference host or from a JSON document that you pre-declare or you found from some other cluster and you want to reuse it on that cluster. Okay? Then you have a chance to review, edit the configuration that you want to apply to your cluster, and then you apply it. Okay? And then you remediate the host in the cluster to that desired state. And I'll go into details about how that works. I'll show a demo, and you can ask questions along the way if you want. So this picture shows the two ways to do it. One on the left for VLCM image-based managed clusters. You just click the box on the bottom that says manage cluster to configuration level, manage configuration to cluster level. And for the baseline managed cluster, it just says, you know, the same thing basically. So in the same new cluster UI, you could do it this way. I'll show a demo where you do that from an existing cluster later. And then, as I mentioned, once you have it enabled, then you create the configuration profiles document, which is the backing profile. Okay, it's in the system, but you can also export it as a JSON file. Okay. And then you can look in the UI to look at what the configuration looks like, or you can look at it in a JSON file. Either way, you can either in the UI edit the profile, or in the JSON document, you can edit the profile. Okay, so I'll get into details since, okay, go ahead, question? Yeah, the store for the profiles at the vCenter layer. But you can, like I said, you can export the profile as a JSON, and then some customers have even taken to managing that profile with the JSON profile using a Git repository. And you can sync, and you have to handle it yourself, but then you can push that up, whatever changes you want in the JSON file, back into vCenter. There's an SDK and APIs for it. Oh yeah, it's no, we don't use ALM to sync the profiles. So you do have to manage it on a cluster by cluster basis. We don't have any cluster-wide feature yet, but that's something that we're looking on the roadmap. What's that? Yeah, so even whether that's between vCenters or even on different clusters, it's all cluster by cluster right now in this current version. Okay. So since this is a code session, I'll get into the schema, right? So the document has a profile section, which is what used for the entire cluster. And then there's another section that's used if you want host-specific configuration, like IP address or something like that, host name, whatever. And then there's things that you may want to override on a host, and that is in the host override section. So you can store host-specific or host overrides in that document. Okay, I guess I can show what that looks like quickly. Okay, so here's just an example of the schema, which again is covers 2,000 plus properties, so I don't want to go through that or anything. But so then you can also export the schema yourself from the product. And if you want, then once you have this configuration established, you can also look at the configuration profile, which is this thing, which is again the deltas from the default here. Okay, so this is an example of some of the things you might have in the profile versus the schema. Okay. But that's the basis for the profile. Okay, so now that you have the profile, you can use that to establish this desired state. So once you establish that on the cluster, you can then check for compliance. Okay, and you can do that on demand, or it also runs on a schedule every 8 hours. So it's just on a hard-coded every 8-hour, background scan. Okay, and when you do that, then it'll check to see what host in the cluster are out of compliance, and then you can go through a flow to then remediate it. Okay, and one thing I have on this slide besides that is that you can set a vCenter alarm if you want to trigger an alarm if there's drift detected in a cluster. Okay, so once you find hosts that are out of compliance, then you can go through a flow to remediate that. So here you check compliance, then you can do a pre-check to determine are you able to remediate if the hosts are healthy or whatever. And it also shows an impact of what the remediation will look like. For example, if there is no impact and it just changes properties on the host, then maybe you can do that, apply the change right away. If the remediation might put your host into maintenance mode or require a reboot, then you can wait to a maintenance window and do it at that time. So that impact analysis is very helpful for you to determine when and how you want to make that remediation. Okay, then when you're ready to do that, then you can click remediate or trigger it via API, of course, and then it will go host by host and do the remediation. If I should say it more clearly, if the hosts need to be put into maintenance mode, it will do that one at a time in serial manner, okay, and if it fails, it'll just stop. If it doesn't require maintenance mode or a reboot, then it will apply to all the hosts at once. So it tries to be as efficient as possible during remediation. Okay? So I'll go through a demo right now and show what that might look like for setting up this configuration profile on a new cluster. So hopefully you can kind of see what's going on, but there's a new cluster being created. This one's called Vegas, I guess. And at the bottom there, I click the Manage Cluster to Configuration Level, which enables that vSphere configuration profile. Okay, so that's a new cluster that has the feature turned on, but it doesn't have any profile set yet. So then, and you can see here, it's when I go now to another host that's not in that cluster, that's this .32 host. It has NTP, it has network configuration, it has VDS associated with it. And that is what I'm going to use for this reference host. So it's just showing all the properties that are there on that reference host. Okay, and now I can go to the Configure tab on the new cluster that was created, called Vegas, and we can bring in a reference host, or pick that host as a reference host, to extract the JSON, to create a profile from that host. So that's what this is doing. And then that creates that file, and then I can go to the configuration thing on the left there, and click Draft, and import from file the JSON that was created from the host that's outside of that cluster. Okay? Right, and then once that configuration is brought in, you can review the settings in the draft section. And you can see that would have the same settings that was done on that reference host, that .32 host that's not in that cluster. And so, okay, and then you can check to see that, you see here the hosts are out of compliance, and then you can just click Apply Changes. And it'll apply the changes to those hosts. I think in this case it didn't have any hosts that are getting impacted by maintenance mode or reboot, so we'll just do them all at the same time. It'll be really fast. Yep, and then once that's done, maybe I'll forward a little bit. You can see that these same settings are now applied on all the hosts in the cluster. Then later, you can run this configure if task and see if later they go out of compliance, say NTP drift or something. You'll get an appliance drift and go through the same workflow to set that back into compliance. Okay? All right, so like I mentioned before, another aspect of this is that it also works with non-VLCM clusters. This was only added in 8.0U3. Okay, so prior versions, 8.0U2 or lower, does not have support for these VUM managed clusters. Okay? So you need to be at that version. Hopefully everybody's planning on going to that version if you're on 8.0 or vSphere 8. And in this one, I'll have another demo right now, which will show how you do this for an existing cluster. Okay, so here there's a baseline managed cluster. And you can see that it's already configured, but we don't have this cluster enabled for vSphere configuration profiles. So we can go to the Configure tab there and say Create Configuration. So this is again for existing cluster. You just go to the Configuration tab and you say Create Configuration. That'll generate a configuration profile. I guess first it's checking to see if it can do it, and then right? Okay, so there you say import from reference host, and in this case we'll pick a host that's already in the cluster. I'm going to use that as the configuration that to be used for all the hosts in the cluster. And then this step says I'm going to validate to make sure that'll work against the other hosts. Okay, and then it says yes, it can do it. Then once again, it'll do another pre-check to see if there's any impact, and then you can apply. So, you know, it's very consistent in the way whether it's a new cluster or an existing cluster, or you're remediating a cluster that's already set up, and you want to just do put it back in those hosts into compliance. Yeah, and then once that's applied, it's just showing that that configuration's been, you know, put on those clusters. So, okay. Yep.
Can you make changes from the UI, or do you always need to make the JSON change?
Oh, the question is, can you do these changes in the configuration profile from the UI? So yeah, if you can see this tab here in this demo that says draft, or this thing that says settings, right? Both of those allow you to see the configuration. The settings would be the ones of the settings of the profile. The draft would be one you're about to apply on a change, but either way you can edit any of the settings in the UI. You don't have to just do everything in JSON if you don't want to. What's that?
It's also applied immediately when you change.
No, it's the same flow. Oh yeah, yeah. So the same flow is there. So the question was, if you do the flow through the UI, will it automatically apply the changes? No, it's going to go through the same flow. It's going to detect that hosts are out of compliance, and then you do a pre-checked impact analysis, pre-checks to see if it's possible to do it, it's valid. Then you do an impact analysis, see what the impact might be of the remediation, and then you remediate. So regardless of how you get to this out of compliance state, the remediation flow is exactly the same.
So, I mean, after the next scan, like the 8 hours, it will immediately pick up the settings and...
yeah, if there's, yeah, or you can just do it right then and there. Yeah.
Like manual one, manual checking.
Yeah, you could manual check or
wait for the 8
or wait
hours.
on the schedule, either way. Yep. Any more questions on this? Okay. All right. So one of the things that we're going to do, okay, is, well, right now I just want to compare. Like, why do I say, like, I'm going to summarize, okay? Maybe a lot of people are using host profiles, or maybe they've used it or used it before and you didn't find it you know, good enough to run, right? And might have some issues with it, running it, right? Like, for example, it may drift out of state or whatever. So this slide is kind of covering why is this a good replacement, right? So host profiles, sometimes the settings or configurations were implemented in a different way through a different method, okay, depending on the ESX team, okay? So now we've moved everything to this ESX config store with a consistent framework with this vSphere configuration profile. So now all of ESX configuration is done through this, okay? And then, yeah. Can you hand him the mic?
Yeah, so the question is, are When will the configuration profiles will be up to par with host profiles?
Yeah, the question is how would host profiles compare with coverage, or vSphere configuration profiles compare with coverage for host profiles? So basically all ESX configuration now with 802.3 is covered with configuration profiles as of 802.3, which is a gap that we filled. I have a slide in a different presentation about that. The one thing that we don't support with configuration profiles is stateless auto deploy. Okay?
That was what I was going to.
Now, if you go to some LCM session later, they might talk about this, but we do not intend to support stateless hosts going forward, right? So it's eventually we want all the hosts to be stateful, using VLCM images as the way to manage this, the life cycle and the vSphere configuration profiles as a configuration. And we're working on a different approach to do that. It's not in the next version, but we're working on it. And very soon afterwards, we'll address that.
Yeah, that explains it.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing is host profiles was managed outside of the host, and now we have put the configuration for every host in the config store and managed against that. And we just manage drift against what's in the config store versus what's in the profile, right? So it's a very more consistent, repeatable framework, which will apply to any type of ESX configuration. Okay, so now we have comprehensive coverage as of 802.3. And then we also support host level overrides. So we are intending to deprecate host profiles in the future. So, but we will, try to cover all the use cases that are required to make sure we don't lose anything when we go and do this change, and it'll be replaced with this. Okay, so we're trying to address this at the ESX layer, the vCenter layer, and then going forward, we're also working on VCF-wide, fleet-wide configuration management as well. So we're trying to build a very comprehensive coverage. The other aspect, since not on these slides or anything, is that we want coverage of all of our, at least SDDC components, right? So in the upcoming versions, we're going to do NSX integration with config profiles, and then we're working on the other components, say like vSAN in the future as well, to have a full, complete cluster configuration story across all of our components.
Can you also change the order in which the configuration profiles are applied? For example, I get a distributed switch I want to create.
It doesn't really have an ordering. So I guess the question that you had is, if I want to configure distributed switch settings on a cluster, and then I also have some other setting, like how would it get applied in order? We don't really have ordering or orchestration right now in the remediation. It just kind of does it all at once. There's some logic that makes it correct, I guess, without any errors, and then we test that one way of doing it, and we don't have orchestration internally today. We have gotten feedback on some use cases where you want to coordinate some of the interactions, but right now we don't have any API to handle that. All right, I think I might be running out of time. Yeah, so any last minute questions before I wrap? If not, thank you for your time, and I'm available during the conference. I have a breakout session tomorrow that will go into more detail and also show a demo of the upcoming NSX integration. So thank you.